Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Naida Tania. Naida is entering her final year of undergraduate study at Ontario Tech University, studying computer science with a data science specialization. She's acted as a teaching assistant for 2 programming workshop courses, teaching C++ at the university, which is where I met her. She's also acted as a peer tutor throughout her university career, providing one-on-one academic support to students. Naida has done internships at IBM, working as a software and backend developer. She's passionate about machine learning, backend development, and DevOps. Naida has worked as an Undergraduate Student Research Fellow under the supervision of Dr. Jeremy Bradbury. In this capacity, she has worked to study 24 novel machine learning features for binary and multinomial classification of attacks, and to engineer artificial datasets for simulating combined intrusion attacks on CAN-bus autonomous vehicles. She has been on the president's list over all of her past 3 years at Ontario Tech, and has achieved numerous honors from her time in high school. In this episode, however, Naida and I will be focusing on some of her research in high school. I hope that Naida's high school research endeavors will inspire any younger students listening to take the first steps towards their first education. I cannot wait to see what this podcast brings, and I'm looking forward to an interesting dialogue. Welcome to the podcast, Naida.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome to get to chat with you. We were just talking before we went live. This is actually the first time that we've talked in person.
Yes.
Like I've had classes where she's been instructing, but we haven't actually had a one-on-one conversation, which is kind of cool. So why don't we get started a little bit with your experience in research? I always like to ask people this. It's a pretty broad question, so go wherever you want with it. But what do you like about research? What got you into research? Kind of a really open question there. What's interesting about research?
Definitely, there's a lot to unpack there. I think I start liking research just as a concept. When you're young and people ask you, what do you want to do in the future? I just like to imagine myself as someone working in a lab with a white coat, just working my brain, trying to figure out something, discover something, invent something. That sounded cool. How I got into research was in that high school, because for the first time I was introduced to a research club in my high school, which I thought was very cool. I haven't heard any of that sort in the previous schools I've entered. So that I spent 2 years in that club. I was able to spend a year doing research. I also was able to become the president of that club for the duration of 2 years, which was very amazing. And I guess since then, I've switched gears a bit. Now I'm in computer science, as Ben has introduced, but even now I'm still highly considering the path of research. So I've been doing research in my summer as well.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Go on.
Right. So you are also saying what I like about research. That's a tricky one. There are pros and cons in research. There are times where it's fun. There are also times where it gets really frustrating. But in general, I think it's very fun to, for me, I like the part where you're very free to explore whatever you want. Of course, it doesn't mean that you can just jump in without any idea whatsoever and just drive recklessly, not that kind of freedom. But with regards to the topic that you have decided, you're free to explore the depths of that topic. You almost all the time, I think almost always, you'll find that you end up learning something that you don't even know it exists, that you don't even know that you'll end up being interested in. So I think that unexpected element was something that really attracts me into research.
For sure. I think about the same kind of thing for me. It's that I guess sense of discovery almost, right? Of exploring the unknown. And I was saying on my last episode of the podcast, it's actually getting released tonight, I believe, or tomorrow, depends on how long it takes to upload. But I was talking to my last guest about how it's interesting when I finished my paper, my first paper, we were working, pulling like 17-hour nights, 17-hour days, I guess, right? Same thing. Night and day kind of, get thrown out the window. And we finally get this thing submitted, and we're super proud of it. And then once that adrenaline that rush dies down, we stopped and we said, you know what? This is new, right? This is like, you can't open a textbook and find this, right?
Yes.
This is something we found. We were wandering in the dark and we found this, right?
Yes.
And it's such a cool thing, right? It's such a cool thing to wrap your head around to some extent. I just find it super neat. So yeah, I totally agree with that. In terms of, because obviously this is for undergraduate students or high school students who are interested in research or, maybe interested in research. What sort of, I always like to ask this one too, and I think it's an interesting question, to say the least. So, people will give you a lot of cliche answers as to, how do you become a good researcher? How can I, as an undergraduate student, how can I get into research, right? It's like, oh yeah, go to office hours and, study for 5 hours a day, right? And, talk to your professors about side projects. And yeah, everyone's heard that, right? What's the most uncliched or non-cliche answer to someone if someone came up to you and said, hey, what can I do to get into research? What's the best advice you could give them that just isn't something that they may have not heard already?
That's a tall order. For someone who wants to get into research, right, they're still contemplating about it. Okay, what I'm gonna throw is something that is both very cliche, but maybe not cliche as I explain it. Which is, if you're contemplating whether you want to do it or not, just do it, quote unquote. Well, part of doing that is that I notice when I'm doing research as well, usually you would have a lot of things on your mind. Should I do research? Should I not do research? Should I do research in this topic with this supervisor? Should I continue on this path or not? Is research even for me? Can I do it well? Can I not do it well? There's a lot of questions around that, and usually you end up weighing the pros and cons, and you become less confident, and then you start doubting yourself and doubting the things that you do. A lot of questions being thrown around. And especially if you just wanting to start research, that means you haven't done it before, then there's not much to lose, really. It's not like just because you've decided to do research now means you've sold your soul to research and you cannot go back anymore. Which conversely means that even if you don't sell your soul to research now, you can still do it in the future. But if you're contemplating it now, means you have a certain degree of interest in it. So if you have an interest in it and you have weighed out the pros and cons, then why not make an informed, just do it. So that would be my advice.
That's a really good piece of advice. It's interesting because every time I talk to, I guess you're going to be the 5th person who I've asked that question to in the past 2 weeks. And every person seems to answer it differently. And it's such a neat question to ask because I feel like it's slightly unexpected to most people, but it's also, it's a really good question, I think. So something popped into my head, and I actually have never asked anyone this question before, so it's kind of neat. How do you know when you're doing research? I feel like I have an answer to this question, but I'd love to hear from you. When you're conducting research, how do you know when you're done? How do you know when to say, okay, this is my paper, it's done, right? How do you know that? And how do you force yourself to stop?
That is tough and also different from case to case basis. I think when it comes to research where you have funding or most of the time when you're still in the school environment, your research is usually tied to a certain club, a certain program, a certain award. Usually they have a time frame. So in those cases, then the answer is simple: when the time is up. When your 4 months is up, when your 1 year is up, you have to submit something, right? You have to have something. So that's where you kind of have to tie the knot. But to abstract that, when it comes to the essence of what you're doing and figuring out when it's done, I would say personally, you have to reflect on what your hypothesis is. When you start up a research, of course, it's important to have a hypothesis. That hypothesis doesn't have to be set in stone. Doesn't mean once you have a question laid out, you must only answer that and not look elsewhere. But you also shouldn't fall into the trap of constantly looking elsewhere and expanding your hypothesis to the point that you may end up be trying to solve world cancer. So I would say in an abstract manner, to know when you're done or to stop yourself would be to look back at your hypothesis. Are you trying to answer too many things, or have you sufficiently answered what you wanted to answer? And maybe then in the future you can answer more questions because the world has infinite things to offer, but just not now.
Yeah, that's totally true, and it's interesting when I was writing my paper, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but we kind of got to a point where it was like, because we were on a time frame, right? We were actually on a 9-day time frame, which was a little bit tight.
Very tight.
But we ended up getting to this point where we were just like, because we're doing data analysis and we're finding these trends and writing the paper, and then we're like, okay, let's keep looking through some data and see if there's anything else we can say about this, right? And so looking through some data, and then it's like, that's a trend. That's a really cool trend, but that's going to take an extra 10 pages to explain.
Yes.
So let's put that in future areas of research.
Yes.
Right? We ended up just making I think it was because we had a 2-column paper similar to what you have, right? And we ended up taking one whole column length page of bullet points just on this could be a future area of research, this could be a future area of research, right? And it's just these are all things that we want to do, but we just don't have time, right?
I think that's why when it comes to research paper, you always have that future research corner. Partially, it's usually the things that you cannot finish within the deadline, but I would say those corner can also contain the things that you wanted to explore in the future.
Yeah, that's what I found as well, definitely. And then the more that you think about it, the more that it's more come to you, right? And you're like, yeah,
yes.
I want to do that, and I want to do that, right? And then that's kind of what's interesting about research, is it's almost addictive to some extent, right?
Yes.
You complete one project and now you have 10 others that you have to do next, right? Because
yes.
you found 10 interesting things that you want to go down, right? So I don't know, it's kind of cool in that sense, right?
It's almost like going down the sorry for cutting you off. It's almost like going down the wiki rabbit hole, I think people usually say.
Exactly, it's exactly like that, and it's your own Wikipedia to some extent, right?
Yes.
You've made your own Wikipedia, and you're doing it to yourself, right? So it's kind of neat, that's for sure. So I feel like we've kind of covered research in general decently well. Why don't we move on to talk about your paper? So
sure.
What I tend to do, just so you're aware and so the audience knows, is I always will link the paper that we talk about in the description, and I'll also put a link to Naida, to your LinkedIn, so that if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to you, they've got your contact info. So we'll do that. So the paper we're talking about, it'll be in the link in the description. And so the title of the paper is Manganese Dioxide-Based Supercapacitor. Really neat paper. I read it, and it's a cool paper because it touches on some, at least for me, I just took physics 2, which is on electromagnetism, and it touches on a lot of those concepts and builds on them. But I guess the lexicon is approachable to a high school student, right? Because it was written by a high school student, right? So it's really neat in that extent that I'm reading a research paper that's about electromagnetism, which definitely is not my field of study. And yet I got to the end of it, and I think this is the first paper that I've had an interview, a podcast episode on, where I've gotten to the end and I'm like, I understand that paper fully, right? And not that that's a bad thing, not that it was it was just really well written, right? To the extent that I could grasp it as an undergrad student, which is really cool. So definitely recommend that you read it. It's not, the audience reads it. It's not too long. It's, I think maybe 5 to 10 pages, somewhere in that range.
Even less than that.
Sorry?
Even less than that. It's about 3 to 4 pages.
Really? Okay. Then it's maybe just 3 to 4 pages. Okay, that's good. So yeah, 3 to 4 pages. So take a read of it. It's definitely a good read. Yeah. So why don't we get started a little bit? What got you interested in this? Because, I mean, if you think about it, right, as a typical high school student, you're not going to go, what's the best material for supercapacitors? Could it be manganese dioxide, right? Odds are most high school people aren't going to be thinking that. What brought you to this train of thought? Is this a passion? Is this just something you were interested in? What brought you to looking into capacitors, and then I'm assuming what brought you to manganese dioxide would be a follow-up question.
Funny that you mentioned that a high school student normally wouldn't just go, oh, manganese dioxide, because at that time, I didn't even know what a supercapacitor is, and took about, I think, a month to actually come to terms with what a supercapacitor actually means. So what happened then was, because as you said, we're high school students, so we're still not quite sure what we want to do. So what my club, the club professors does is they give us a list of topics that we're interested in, say maybe nanoparticles, sustainable energy, machine learning, maybe if you're interested, things like that. And we just select what topics that we may be interested in, and we'll be introduced to a university professor who actually knows what they're doing, and we'll be learning from them. So at that time, the topic is very open-ended. We don't have to have or already have a specific idea in mind and say, I want to do this research. So at that time, I thought sustainable energy does sound interesting, and I like chemistry. I wanted to do something in the field of chemistry. So I ticked those boxes, and I got introduced to a professor that does research in energy as well as supercapacitors. So I thought, okay, sounds interesting, and that's how I spent 1 year of my high school in this research.
That's pretty awesome. So, in terms of the other the co-authors of that paper, were they classmates in this club, the research club you were talking about?
You can say they're classmates, so they are fellow mates in the club as well. We are instructed specifically to form a group of 3, understandably to make our work lighter because we're still doing normal high school lives alongside this 1-year research. So
that makes sense. So it was more of like a sort of structured 1-year time frame to get this done with a professor, right?
Mm-hmm.
That definitely makes sense. I think that's a really cool club. I actually kind of wish that I had something like that in my high school. I don't know if that's just like because you went to high school in Singapore, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's just I don't know if that's just like Thunder Bay where I live, or if that's just we don't have that. Because I know we don't across the city, right? Or if that's like a broader thing that maybe Ontario or Canada doesn't have. I'm not sure, but I feel like if there are any students, if your high school doesn't have one, that could be a really interesting thing to start up, because they do exist. And until I started talking to you about this, a few minutes ago, I didn't actually realize that that was a thing that existed in high school. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, definitely, if you're interested, this would be a good thing to put on a resume. You want volunteer hours in high school? This is a good thing to do.
If it doesn't exist in your high school, for those who's listening, I would say make one. I think it's very rare to have a science research club. I was very fortunate to find one. So if it doesn't exist in your school, suggest one, make one, put it in your resume. Awesome.
Exactly. It's a great thing to put in a resume, especially if you're interested in research, right?
Yes.
Will get you pretty far. So in terms of, so we got that. Why don't we touch on what exactly is a supercapacitor? Of course, I read your paper, but let's for all those high school students who are still struggling to understand what supercapacitors are, if you want to break that down, that'd be awesome.
Mm-hmm. So how I like to describe it was, so imagine battery. Everyone knows battery. A lot of our devices are operated by batteries. So battery is a device that can store energy, it can release energy, and you can sometimes recharge it depending on the type of batteries that you have. So supercapacitor is kind of like a step above that. What's superior about supercapacitor is that it can store more energy actually, no, scratch that. It can deliver more energy than a battery. So, say, with the same size supercapacitor and a battery, say a battery can power a remote control, while a supercapacitor maybe can power up a car, just as an exaggeration. But what's also the downfall of supercapacitor, the reason why you're not really seeing it around in your devices as opposed to a battery, is that it's still expensive. And on top of that, it still cannot store a lot of energy. It stores about 10 to 20% of energy that a battery can as of writing that paper. There might be other breakthroughs by now. So that's, in essence, is a supercapacitor. Maybe you can think of it as a future of what battery might look like.
So in terms of, I don't know, I mean, people have obviously seen batteries.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope. People have, I would imagine if you haven't seen a capacitor, that's just a normal capacitor. It's just like a little silo looking thing with like two sticks at the bottom. Mm-hmm. What does a supercapacitor look like? Can you visualize it? Is it similar to what a capacitor would look like a standard capacitor?
Honestly, throughout that 1 year research, I have not seen an actual supercapacitor. We're investigating an ideal material for the supercapacitor, but we have never actually made one. So, to answer you, I have no idea. Probably something similar.
Probably something similar. That's totally fine. So, if you're interested in knowing, audience, take a Google.
Yes.
Google
Do the research.
Google images and take a look. So, I don't know if we ended up getting to it. What brought you to manganese dioxide as an option for the supercapacitor?
So, the professor that I was working under is part of his specialty is looking into this chemical components and what can maximize storage of energy and so on. So we look into several possible chemical options, but ideally what we want to move towards is to make supercapacitor something that is more like a battery, right? Something that is more widely used. What's the criteria for that? Well, we want it to be cheap. We want it to be readily available. The idea is a sustainable energy. We don't want something that works for 10 years and then you can't have that material anymore because it's gone. But we also want to tackle the one main thing about supercapacitor, the reason why it's not widely adopted, which is it cannot even store a lot of energy. So we compare several elements possible, and we decided that manganese dioxide is a good element to investigate for a year and try to expand on that, see how we can optimize its performance.
And I think that one of the reasons that you, at least you illustrated in the paper, was that it's rather widely available, right? It's not like I think there was one kind of, frankly, and this doesn't happen often. So like I'm saying, this is a really well-written research paper, but it doesn't happen often that you kind of chuckle when you're reading a paper. And it was, however, it was this line here, I'll just read it. You were talking about ruthenium dioxide, is that how you say it? I don't know, I'm not good at chemistry. So you wrote, however, high cost, low porosity, and toxic nature of RuO2 limit commercialization of supercapacitors using this material. And I kind of laughed, and I was like, yeah, that would do it.
Yes.
I'm glad that we don't have those, in the cupboards, and kids can get their hands on them and that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's bad enough if a kid eats a AAA battery, as long as it's not a ruthenium dioxide. That's terrible. So in terms of so I think that was an interesting one because it sort of illustrates how it's ruthenium dioxide appears to be more rare, or at least more difficult to extract to get it. And when you're looking at it, I can't recall. I think you said it was one of the more. I believe you gave a number as to like how abundant it was, but that's it's in the paper as a specific. that sort of stuff, or even coming up with hypotheses. And I asked him, like, I think my question to him was, can you tell me like about a time where you came up with a hypothesis, you've developed this model or this experiment or whatever, and you got to the end and you were like, huh, that's not what I expected, right? And
Yes.
he chuckled and he said, which one should I tell you about? And so he, it was interesting, but it's that kind of stuff that I love to hear, because it kind of shows people, right, that shows our audience that there's really, like, it's okay to mess up. Like this guy, this PhD student messed up, so you can mess up, right? You're an undergrad, go for it, right? You're learning, so do it. So we're kind of getting to the wrapping point here in the conversation. And I asked this to my last guest, and I'm going to ask it to you. And a fair warning, this is a very dangerous question for me to ask. So you have to be careful. We can't get into an argument about this. What is your favorite programming language and why?
I think my answer has always been very simple. I like Python. A lot of people say, usually, I think when it comes to favorite programming language, is the one that you find you go towards that language whenever you want to discover something. So what I find is, regardless of if I'm given a task, say, make a program that can, I don't know, check the current time in Australia. That's a very weird order. But if I given an order something like that, then the first language that I would go to is Python. It doesn't have to be, I know that sometimes people think, oh, it has to be like a modern language or a language that is, you need to weigh the pros and cons. Can this language be fast enough? Can this language do a lot of things? Does this language have enough libraries that support X functionality, Y functionality, and so on? But I think my criteria of a favorite programming language is really just something that gets you from point A to point B, something that is your favorite tool, so you would use it whenever you have to. So yeah, I would say it's Python.
Sort of like a step between pseudocode and actual code for a lot of things, right? Because in some situations you're making a thing, like, I don't know, if you're making like a I don't know, something that needs to be quick, or got to be like quick execution in that, you probably might not want to do, or like quick runtime, you probably might want to avoid Python. You're doing some like heavy graphics, you probably want to avoid Python, but it's still cool to, like, for me at least, if I'm doing something like that. I know in our programming workshop course, a lot of the time what I would do is I would just pull out my Python, my VS Code, and go into some Python and just write out the Python script and then think about that and say, okay, that makes sense. Now let's transfer this to C++, right?
Yes. So I think that's where the dangerous part comes in. Just because something is your favorite language doesn't mean you have to use that for every single thing that you do.
Exactly.
There
you have to know how to use the other ones.
Yes, there are right time and place for things. Just because it's your favorite doesn't mean it's the one that can do everything.
So then a follow-up question, and you can pick whichever one of these you want to answer, if you want to do both or whatever, it doesn't matter. In Python, what is your favorite, is the terminology package, library? I can't recall what the terminology is for it.
Sounds like package sounds right.
Package seems right.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite package, or what package do you use the most? Because I feel like maybe they're the same, maybe they're different, I don't know.
I feel like this is secretly a test of whether I'm a programmer or not. Just kidding. But I think the one that I find I use a lot has to be pandas and NumPy. Probably because a lot of the things that I like to do, or the things that I end up doing, or the things that that leaves the most impression in my mind tends to do with data science. But those are the most widely used packages when it comes to data science, pandas and NumPy. And they are a lot helpful. At least what I find with regards to, say, other languages, sometimes I have experience where I have to do a bit of data analysis in other languages, and I find that it's definitely more rigorous to have to do so in, say, Java, as opposed to using these utilities that pandas and numpy has offered. Everything looks very sleek and everything can be done very nicely. So I guess pandas and numpy. Maybe matplotlib on the side.
Yeah, that's probably about the same. Oddly enough, though, I find it interesting. I've done like quite a bit of data analysis. I mean, I only learned Python like less than a year ago. Yeah, I wrote my first Hello World in September of last year.
Same.
So 11 months of Python, but I like, it's interesting because I've used, pandas, I've used like sklearn, I've used, natural language processing, I've done all these crazy data stuff. And I really haven't used NumPy, which feels like it should be the one that you would use, like it would feel like that would be the most basic library to use. It's so, universal. Of course I've used pandas because I don't think you can really get away with not using pandas.
Yes.
But I feel like somewhere down the line, I'm going to be doing some work and I'm going to be like, maybe I should look if there's an easier way to do this, and then I'll come across NumPy. And I know that's going to happen at some point. I'm just like, at this point, I'm just, doing the research as quickly as I can, which is using the ways that I know how, which is just raw Python at the end of the day. Not ideal, but it works, right?
When it comes to research, it's really whatever works, whatever that gets you from point A to point B. Unless your research is about optimization, then what you're doing, I would say, is typically what I would do as well. Don't get too tangled up with trying to present things in a neat manner. If it answers your question, do it.
Awesome. Any final words? Any final points for listeners? Anything you want to say before we end?
To those of you listening who actually is still doubting whether you should go research or not, just do it. To reiterate that. After you do some research and make an informed decision out of it.
On that note, thanks for joining.
Thank you to you too.
That was a really productive conversation, I think. Yeah, that was really cool. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. That was episode 4, I think. I don't remember these things. I just post. And yeah, we'll see you next time, I guess.